What if the first people to build cities never saw the sun rise over them? Not because they couldn't, not because they were forbidden, but because something in their very nature, in the architecture of their existence, made daylight unbearable. What if, long before we learned to worship the sun, there were those who built their entire world in its absence? Imagine this. Settlements constructed not on hilltops where morning light could pour golden over fields, but deep in shadowed valleys where the sun's rays arrived late and departed early. Stone walls that faced away from the eastern horizon. Doorways oriented toward the west, toward the coming darkness. Windows carved narrow and high, designed not to welcome light but to ration it, to filter it, to keep it at bay. This is not speculation drawn from fantasy. This is archaeology whispering something we're only beginning to hear. If you're drawn to the kind of history that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks, the stories that sleep in shadows and wake only when we're brave enough to listen, then stay with us on this journey. And if you feel that pull, that quiet resonance, let me know where you're listening from tonight. Are you in a room touched by streetlight? In darkness? Tell me in the comments. We're all wandering together, because what we're about to explore challenges something fundamental about how we understand human civilization itself. We've been taught a simple narrative. Humans evolved, discovered fire, learned to control it, and built societies around its warmth and light. We gathered around flames. We pushed back the darkness. We became creatures of the day, extending our productive hours, our safety, our dominion over the night. But what if that story is incomplete? What if there were people who chose differently? In 1964, archaeologists working in the Zagros Mountains discovered something peculiar. A settlement, later dated to approximately 9,000 years ago, nestled so deeply into a valley that even at summer solstice, direct sunlight reached the main plaza for fewer than 4 hours. The structures weren't arranged randomly. They formed a deliberate pattern, a calculated architecture that maximized shadow. At first, researchers assumed this was pragmatic. Perhaps the people sought shelter from summer heat. Mediterranean and Middle Eastern peoples have long built this way, creating cool refuges against brutal sun. But the details didn't align. The settlement existed in a temperate zone where summer heat, while present, was far from extreme. More puzzling, every dwelling entrance faced west or northwest. Every single one. Across dozens of structures, not one doorway welcomed the morning sun. We might dismiss this as coincidence, as cultural preference with no deeper meaning, until we found the others. 3 years later, a similar site emerged in what is now northern Iraq. Different valley, different watershed, but the same architectural fingerprint. Buildings pressed into shadow, entrances uniformly oriented away from dawn. And here something new, the tools. Archaeological sites typically yield tools worn in predictable patterns. Blades dulled from cutting in daylight. Pottery shaped and fired under the sun. But these tools told a different story. The cutting implements showed where patterns consistent with use in minimal light. The angles, the grip positions, the very ergonomics suggested hands working in dimness. Stone lamps, dozens of them, far more than other contemporary sites. And the oil residue inside them, analyzed decades later with modern spectrometry, showed continuous, heavy use. These weren't occasional lighting sources. They were essential infrastructure. These people weren't just living in shadow. They were optimizing for it. Think about that for a moment. Think about the deliberate choice embedded in every tool, every wall, every doorway. This wasn't accident or necessity. This was design. This was culture. And then we found the pigments, ochre and charcoal mixtures, applied to walls in patterns. But not where you'd expect. Not in central gathering spaces or prominent facades. Instead, on interior walls in the deepest rooms, the places where daylight never reached. Images painted for eyes that worked in darkness. Viewed by flickering lamplight that would make them seem to move, to breathe, to live. Who paints for an audience of shadow? If this were isolated, we could construct comfortable explanations. Cultural quirk. Local adaptation. Unusual but not paradigm-shifting. But it's not isolated. In the years since those first discoveries, 17 sites across a broad geographic range have revealed similar characteristics. 17 settlements, spanning from Anatolia to the Iranian plateau, all sharing this nocturnal signature. All dated to a narrow window of time, between 9,000 and 7,500 years ago. 17 chances for coincidence to explain itself. 17 failures to do so. These sites share something else, something written in the bones themselves. Human remains from these settlements show peculiar adaptations. Skeletal markers suggest reduced sun exposure during growth years. Vitamin D deficiency indicators appear frequently, yet these populations thrived. They weren't malnourished. They weren't weak. Bone density, muscle attachment points all suggest robust, healthy people. People whose bodies bore the signature of darkness. The isotope analysis of their teeth enamel, which records chemical signatures of childhood environment, shows patterns unlike neighboring populations. These weren't nomads who happened to settle in shadow. These were people raised in it generation after generation. This is where the evidence stops being merely curious and becomes genuinely unsettling. Because what we're looking at isn't adaptation to circumstance. It's cultivation of preference. It's the deliberate construction of a nocturnal existence by people who had other options, who knew daylight, who chose darkness anyway. Why? The myths call them different names, but the pattern is consistent. In Sumerian fragments, predating even the earliest king lists, there are references to the Esidim, the spirits of the dark foundation. Not demons, not monsters, but people, builders. The texts are fragmentary, damaged, but the recurring phrases speak of those who laid stones when the sun slept and whose eyes were filled with stars. In Proto-Elamite tablets, discovered in southwestern Iran and still only partially deciphered, similar references appear. Symbols that appear to mean night or shadow are paired repeatedly with symbols denoting city and first. The implications are provocative. Cities of shadow, first cities, cities of night. Were these myths remembering something real? Ancient Mesopotamian astronomy, which reached sophisticated heights, contains curious gaps. Their solar observations, while accurate, are oddly sparse compared to their meticulous lunar and stellar records. They tracked the moon's phases with obsessive precision. They cataloged stars. They predicted eclipses. But their solar data feels almost perfunctory, like an obligation rather than a passion. What civilization obsesses over the night sky while treating the sun as an afterthought? Unless, of course, the night sky was their primary experience. Unless darkness was home. The old Persian texts, much later but potentially preserving older traditions, speak of the Sabneshan, the night dwellers. These weren't described as cursed or monstrous. They were described as wise, as ancient, as possessing knowledge that daylight could not reveal. They were teachers, according to some fragments, keepers of secrets, and in one particularly intriguing passage, translated from a fire-damaged tablet found at Persepolis, they taught us the stars by which to measure the year, for they had watched them longer than memory could hold. How long does one have to watch the stars for it to exceed memory? Let's pause here. Let me ask you something. Have you ever stayed awake through an entire night? Not from insomnia or obligation, but by choice? Have you felt how the world changes after midnight, after that invisible threshold when one day becomes another? The quality of silence, the texture of darkness, the way consciousness itself seems to shift, to open toward different thoughts, different awareness. Now imagine living entirely in that state. Imagine building a civilization there. If you're still with me, still following this thread through darkness, consider subscribing. Not because I'm asking, but because this story goes deeper than one video can hold. There are more settlements, more myths, more impossible questions waiting. Only if you want to keep wandering with me. The linguistic evidence adds another layer. Several proto-languages from this region contain word roots that don't quite fit expected patterns. Etymologists have long puzzled over certain terms for time, vision, and knowing that seem to assume darkness as the default state. Where most languages develop words for night as a departure from day, these roots suggest the opposite. Light is the deviation, darkness is the norm. One example. In reconstructed Proto-Hurrian, a language spoken in this exact region. The word for seeing appears to derive from a root meaning to perceive in shadow. The word for what we'd call daylight vision is actually a compound, overlight seeing, as if it required special designation. Languages evolve from experience. They encode what matters to speakers. What does it mean when a language treats darkness as the primary condition of perception? The burial practices offer another clue. In most Neolithic cultures, burial orientation relates to solar cycles. Bodies face east to greet the rising sun, or west to follow its setting, or aligned with solstices. These alignments appear across continents, across cultures that never contacted each other. The sun dominates death ritual because it dominated life. But in these 17 nocturnal settlements, burial orientations ignore the sun entirely. Instead, they align with stellar positions, specific stars visible only at specific times of night. The mathematics involved are sophisticated, requiring generations of careful observation to establish. These people oriented their dead to the stars, not to the sun. Think about what that means. Think about what you have to believe about the cosmos, about existence, about what waits after death to make that choice. The sun, dominant in every sky, giver of warmth and life, irrelevant. But those cold, distant lights burning in the void? Those mattered. Those were home. The astronomical alignments grow more complex as we analyze them. Several burial sites align with stars that were visible in that epoch but have since shifted due to precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. This confirms the site's dates but also demonstrates remarkable astronomical knowledge. They track stars that wouldn't return to the same position for thousands of years. They encoded that knowledge in stone. They considered it more important than solar orientation. Why would a diurnal people of the day, develop such profound knowledge of the night sky while treating the sun as secondary? They wouldn't. The artifacts themselves whisper this same story. Items made for use in darkness dominate the assemblages. Not just lamps, but polished obsidian mirrors designed to reflect minimal light. Not just tools for night work, but jewelry, art objects, ceremonial items all optimized for low-light conditions. Black basalt carved with subtle textures that would be invisible in bright sun but would come alive in flickering flame light. These weren't practical adaptations. These were aesthetic choices. This was culture, a culture of night. In one particularly well-preserved dwelling, archaeologists found pigment palettes containing minerals that only reveal their true colors in dim light. In bright sun, they appear dull, brownish, unremarkable. But by lamplight, they glow. Subtle, beautiful, carefully chosen for the conditions under which they'd be seen. Someone stood in a lamplit room and selected those specific minerals because of how they looked in that specific light. Someone cared about beauty in darkness. Who were these people? The skeletal evidence shows they were anatomically identical to other humans of their era. No biological differences, no subspecies classification. They were us. Homo sapiens, identical in bone structure, brain case capacity, every measurable way. But something in their neurology, their circadian rhythms, their very relationship with light and darkness, something differed. Modern humans can adapt to night shifts, to altered schedules, but our biology fights us. Melatonin production, cortisol cycles, 100 subtle hormonal patterns evolved around daylight. We can override them, but at a cost. Health impacts, psychological stress, increased disease risk. Yet these populations thrived for at least 1,500 years, possibly longer. 15 centuries of continuous nocturnal culture with no apparent decline, no health crisis, no collapse from circadian dysregulation. How? The answer might lie not in biology but in selection. Consider this: in any human population, a small percentage displays naturally delayed sleep phase syndrome. Their circadian rhythms run several hours behind the norm. They're called night owls, but that's a diminishment. These are people whose biochemistry genuinely operates on a different schedule, whose cortisol peaks at midnight instead of dawn, whose melatonin production follows a shifted curve. In modern society, these individuals struggle. They're called lazy, undisciplined. They force themselves into day schedules that war with their biology. but they exist stubbornly in every population at roughly the same percentage. What if, instead of being outliers, they were the founders? What if a group of these naturally nocturnal individuals, recognized in their communities as different, as other, as uncomfortable in daylight, decided to build something for themselves? Found each other across family groups and settlements and said, "We don't have to live by their rhythm. We can build our own." It's not unprecedented. Religious minorities, ethnic groups, political dissidents, throughout history, people who don't fit have departed to build societies reflecting their nature. Why not circadian minorities? They'd choose valleys that minimize daylight exposure. They'd develop tools for darkness. They'd create art for lamplight. And over generations, they'd refine it. Others like them would hear and join. The settlements would grow, not despite their nocturnal nature but because of it. A culture of the naturally nocturnal, building a civilization that honored their rhythms instead of suppressing them. It's beautiful in a way. It's human. The eternal drive to find others like ourselves, to build spaces where we can exist without compromise. But there's something else in the evidence. Something this explanation doesn't quite cover. The settlements appear suddenly in the archaeological record. No gradual development, no protophases. They emerge fully formed with established architectural principles, sophisticated tool traditions, developed artistic conventions. It's as if the entire cultural package appeared at once. Cultures don't work that way. They evolve, adapt, develop over generations. Yet here we have nocturnal architecture, nocturnal tools, nocturnal aesthetics all arriving together, refined, complete. Unless they didn't invent it, unless they brought it. From where? This is where archaeology meets the limits of what it can tell us. We have the sites, we have the artifacts, we have the bones. What we don't have is the before. Where did these people come from before they appeared in these valleys? What settlements predated these 17? Were there others that left no trace, built in places now lost to time and geology? The Younger Dryas impact theory proposes that around 12,800 years ago, a cosmic impact event triggered rapid climate change. Evidence for this impact grows stronger each year. Nanodiamonds in sediment layers, platinum anomalies, shocked quartz. The event would have caused catastrophic flooding, wildfires, a brief return to glacial conditions. What if a civilization existed before that impact? What if its survivors scattered, regrouped, tried to rebuild what they'd lost? What if those survivors were naturally, fundamentally nocturnal? The timeline almost works. The impact, 12,800 years ago. The appearance of nocturnal settlements, 9,000 years ago. A gap of nearly 4,000 years. Time enough for scattered survivors to wander, to search, to eventually find each other and attempt restoration. But restoration of what? Look at the sophistication embedded in these sites. The astronomical knowledge alone requires centuries of accumulated observation. The architectural principles suggest established traditions, refined over generations. These weren't pioneers experimenting. These were people executing a known pattern. A pattern learned where? If you've made it this far, you're thinking the same questions I am. You're feeling that same disquiet, that sense that history is bigger and stranger than we've been told. Leave a comment. Tell me what you're thinking. Tell me if you've noticed something I haven't. We're mapping shadows together, you and I. The genetic evidence offers tantalizing hints but no conclusions. DNA extracted from remains at these sites shows typical Neolithic Near Eastern profiles. No dramatic differences, no unknown haplogroups. But genetics can't tell us everything. It can't tell us about culture, belief, the conscious choices that define who we become. And there's something else. Something subtle in the data that geneticists have noted but can't quite explain. The populations at these nocturnal sites show slightly reduced genetic diversity compared to contemporary settlements. Not inbreeding, the populations were large enough to avoid that. But less diversity, as if drawn from a more specific subset of the broader population. As if they were selected, or self-selected. The myths speak of the children of night not as cursed but as chosen. In several fragmented texts, they're described as having knowledge that daylight burned away. They're portrayed as wise but separate, powerful but apart. One Akkadian text, dated much later but possibly preserving older oral traditions, describes the night dwellers as having eyes that held the void. It's poetic language, but what does it actually mean? Superior night vision? Different pupil structure? Or something metaphorical, something about how they perceived reality itself? We're trained to read ancient texts as purely symbolic, as myth divorced from history. But what if some myths are memory? What if they're the distorted echo of real events, real people, filtered through generations of oral retelling until only the emotional truth remains? The emotional truth of the night dweller myths is consistent. They were ancient, knowledgeable, separate, and gone. The settlements vanish from the archaeological record around 7,500 years ago. Not gradually declining, not merging with other cultures. Just absent. The sites appear to have been deliberately abandoned, not destroyed. No signs of warfare, no burning, no catastrophic ending. The people simply left. Where did they go? Some artifacts from slightly later periods, found scattered across the region, bear stylistic similarities to the nocturnal settlements. A lamp here, a pottery motif there, traces echoes, as if the culture dispersed, fragmented, integrated into the broader human tapestry but never entirely vanished. Or perhaps they found new valleys, deeper shadows, places we haven't discovered yet, places where they could continue their nocturnal existence away from the expanding daylight cultures that were beginning to dominate the landscape. The Bronze Age was beginning. Agriculture was intensifying. Trade networks expanding. Daylight economies, solar calendars, sun gods rising to prominence. There was less and less room for those who lived differently, who oriented their existence toward darkness. Perhaps they recognized what was coming. Perhaps they looked at the growing daylight world and chose to retreat further into shadow rather than adapt, rather than compromise what they were. There's something profoundly sad in that possibility. Something that speaks to every person who's ever felt out of step with the world's rhythm. Every soul who's looked at mainstream culture and thought, this isn't for me. But there's also something beautiful. The refusal to assimilate. The insistence on remaining true to one's nature, even at the cost of isolation. We need to talk about the artifacts that don't make sense. In 2003, during excavation of one of the northern sites, archaeologists discovered something peculiar. A series of thin stone discs, each about the size of a palm, carved with intricate spiral patterns. In daylight, the spirals appeared merely decorative. But when researchers photographed them under controlled low-light conditions, something remarkable emerged. The spirals created optical illusions. In flickering lamp light, they appeared to move, to rotate, to draw the eye inward toward the center. The effect was hypnotic. These weren't tools. They weren't practical objects. They were something else entirely. One researcher, after staring at them for several minutes in simulated lamp-light conditions, reported feeling deeply relaxed, almost trance-like. Others confirmed similar experiences. The discs were doing something to consciousness, something subtle but measurable. Were these meditation aids? Religious artifacts? Tools for altering perception? We know from ethnographic studies that many cultures use visual techniques to induce altered states. Tibetan mandalas, Islamic geometric patterns, Aboriginal paintings. The human visual system can be hacked, guided toward different modes of awareness through careful manipulation of pattern and light. But those traditions are recent, historically documented. These stone discs are 9,000 years old, created by people who lived in perpetual dimness. What did they know about consciousness and perception that we've forgotten? The discs were found in every dwelling, not just in special ceremonial spaces. This wasn't rare knowledge held by priests or elite. This was everyday practice, common as pottery. Imagine a culture where altering consciousness was as routine as cooking, where the boundaries between ordinary awareness and trance states were crossed daily, casually, as naturally as we might drink coffee to wake or wine to relax. What would such people experience? What would they know? The neurological research on prolonged darkness exposure offers intriguing possibilities. Studies on people living in extreme northern latitudes, experiencing months of polar night, show that extended darkness triggers increased DMT production in the pineal gland. Not enough to cause hallucinations, but enough to subtly shift perception, to make consciousness more fluid, more open to non-ordinary experience. Modern subjects report increased dream vividness, greater introspective awareness, a sense of expanded consciousness. They describe reality as feeling more symbolic, more meaningful. They notice patterns and connections they'd miss in ordinary daylight consciousness. Now imagine not seasonal darkness but chosen perpetual darkness. Imagine a society whose neurology had adapted to this state over generations. What would they perceive that we don't? What aspects of reality would be obvious to them that remain hidden to us? The ancient text's descriptions of the night dwellers as possessing special knowledge suddenly seems less metaphorical. Perhaps they did see things differently. Perhaps darkness, combined with the consciousness practices suggested by those stone discs, opened perceptual doors that daylight keeps closed. We think of ourselves as the pinnacle of human awareness. We have science, technology, accumulated knowledge. But what if we've traded certain perceptual capabilities for others? What if in gaining daylight mastery, we lost something these ancient nocturnal people possessed? There's no way to know, but the question haunts. The cave paintings in the region, slightly later than the settlements but possibly connected, show something unusual. Unlike most Paleolithic and Neolithic art, which depicts animals and hunting scenes in naturalistic styles, these show abstract patterns. Spirals, yes, but also more complex geometric forms. Fractals, patterns that repeat at different scales. Modern psychedelic researchers recognize these patterns immediately. They're the visual geometry reported during altered states, the fundamental patterns consciousness generates when perception is shifted beyond ordinary bounds. Were these paintings documenting inner visions? Were the night dwellers exploring consciousness in ways we're only rediscovering now with modern pharmacology and meditation practices? The pottery from the settlements shows similar geometric complexity. On utilitarian objects, storage jars, bowls, everyday items, we find mathematical precision in decorative patterns. Ratios that appear random reveal themselves under analysis to be carefully calculated. Fibonacci sequences, golden ratios, the same mathematical constants that appear in nature, in seashells and flower petals and galaxy spirals. They embedded mathematical truth in their everyday objects. Not as show, not for elite audiences, but for themselves. Because it mattered to them. Because they saw these patterns as significant. What culture treats fundamental mathematical constants as appropriate decoration for cooking pots? A culture that understood, deeply and intuitively, the mathematical structure underlying reality. A culture whose altered perceptual states let them see those patterns directly, let them experience the geometric foundation of existence. I'm not suggesting mysticism over science. I'm suggesting that different neurological states access different information. That consciousness is more flexible, more capable than we usually recognize. That these night dwellers might have developed practices we're only beginning to understand. If this resonates with you, if you feel that pull toward the unexplored territories of human potential, stay with me. There are more videos coming, more questions, more impossible evidence. Subscribe only if you want to keep pushing at the boundaries of what we think we know about human history and human consciousness. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the burial alignments makes more sense in this context. If the night dwellers regularly entered altered states, if they practiced techniques for shifting consciousness, they would have spent more time in deep introspective states under the stars. They would have watched the sky not just with eyes but with whatever expanded awareness their practices induced. Ancient astronomers across cultures report experiencing revelatory insights, sudden understanding of celestial mechanics that seem to come from somewhere beyond rational thought. The Mayans, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, all describe astronomical knowledge as revealed rather than discovered. What if revelation is real? Not supernatural, not divine, but a natural function of consciousness operating in certain states? What if the night dwellers had systematized this, turned it into reliable practice? The precision of their star tracking suggests exactly that. This wasn't trial and error astronomy. This was knowledge that felt true, that was verified by observation but initially grasped through some other means. We're reaching the limits of what archaeology and conventional history can tell us. The artifacts are silent on subjective experience. The bones can't tell us what these people felt, what they knew, what they experienced in their lamplit dwellings while the world outside slept. But the traces suggest something profound, something we've lost or forgotten or never knew to look for. The myth fragments speak of the night dwellers teaching others, passing on knowledge before they departed. What knowledge? The texts are too damaged, too fragmentary to say. But they suggest that the night dwellers didn't simply vanish. They left something behind. Seeds, ideas, practices. Maybe we're still living with those gifts without recognizing their source. Our fascination with altered states, our drive to explore consciousness, our sense that ordinary awareness isn't the full story. Perhaps these aren't modern developments. Perhaps they're echoes, old memories stirring in our collective unconscious, remnants of what the night dwellers knew. Every culture has myths of ancient teachers, wise elders who gave humanity fire or agriculture or writing or law. We read these as symbolic, as psychological projections. But what if some are memories, distorted, mythologized, but rooted in real encounters with real people who really did possess advanced knowledge? The night dwellers weren't superhuman. They were human like us, with the same brains, the same biological potential. But they developed that potential in directions we haven't, explored territories of consciousness we're only now remembering exist. And then they vanished. The question that haunts every researcher who studies these sites. Why did they abandon them? Around 7,500 years ago, these thriving settlements, 17 sites spread across hundreds of miles, representing a culture that had successfully maintained its nocturnal existence for 15 centuries, were deliberately abandoned. Not destroyed, not conquered, just left. The evidence is clear. No burn layers, no skeletal remains suggesting violence, no signs of disease or famine. The settlements simply empty one day, as if the people walked away and never returned. Archaeological sites usually show clear reasons for abandonment. Environmental collapse, depleted soil, failed water sources, warfare, destruction layers, burned walls, mass graves, disease, multiple burials, hasty disposal of bodies, climate change, shifts in settlement patterns following new environmental conditions. None of these appear at the nocturnal sites. Instead, we find something stranger. In several locations, the inhabitants carefully cached valuable items before leaving. Not scattered or hidden in panic, but deliberately placed in sealed chambers, as if stored for eventual return. Tools, ceremonial objects, those mysterious spiral discs, preserved carefully and left behind. People who plan to return don't abandon everything. People fleeing crisis don't take time to carefully preserve and cache artifacts. So what were they doing? One possibility. They knew they wouldn't return, but they wanted to preserve something for whoever might find these places later. For us, perhaps, a message in the archaeological record, waiting to be decoded. Another possibility. They did return or intended to, but something prevented them. Some catastrophe or change we can't identify erased their second chapter from the record, leaving only this mysterious departure. The third possibility is the most unsettling. They evolved beyond needing physical settlements. They found something, learned something that made fixed dwelling places obsolete. That sounds like fantasy, but bear with me. The trajectory of the nocturnal culture shows increasing sophistication over its 1,500 years. The later sites contain more complex artifacts, more refined astronomical alignments, more elaborate consciousness-altering tools. It's the arc of a culture going somewhere, developing toward something. What if they achieved it? What if whatever they were seeking through their darkness, their stars, their spiral-induced trances they finally found? We have scattered references in much later texts to wandering teachers, night-walking sages who appeared in settlements to share knowledge and then departed. Always the same description. They preferred darkness, spoke in riddles, knew the stars intimately, and seemed to exist outside normal time. Legends? Certainly. But legends sometimes preserve cores of truth. What if the night dwellers didn't vanish but dispersed? What if they became nomadic, wandering teachers instead of settled communities? That would explain the stylistic traces appearing across wide areas in later periods. That would explain the myths of nocturnal sages. It would also explain why we can't find their ending. There wasn't one, just a transformation. But this is speculation built on shadows. The evidence doesn't support firm conclusions. What we have are questions, possibilities, tantalizing hints that something remarkable happened and then was lost to time, or hidden. There's a deeper current running through all this, something we need to acknowledge directly. Modern civilization is overwhelmingly diurnal. We've built our entire world around daylight productivity. We've eliminated darkness wherever possible. Street lights, building lights, screens glowing in every room. We treat darkness as something to overcome, to defeat, to push back. But darkness is half of existence, half of every day. Half of our evolutionary history occurred in darkness, under stars, with firelight and moonlight as our only illumination. What have we lost by banishing night so completely? What aspects of human potential are tied to darkness, to that specific neurological state that extended night induces? The night dwellers might have understood something we've forgotten. That darkness isn't the absence of light. It's its own presence, its own condition, with unique affordances and possibilities. Modern sleep research shows we're chronically sleep-deprived, perpetually out of sync with our circadian rhythms. Depression, anxiety, and numerous health issues correlate with disrupted sleep and excessive artificial light exposure. We're fighting our own biology, forcing ourselves into patterns that don't match how we evolved. Perhaps the night dwellers were onto something. Perhaps there's wisdom in honoring darkness, in creating spaces where night is welcome rather than banished. I'm not suggesting we all become nocturnal, but maybe we should pay attention to what happens when we do encounter darkness. When the power goes out, when we're camping under stars, when we can't sleep and sit awake at 3 a.m. There's a quality to consciousness in those moments. Isn't there? Something different. Thoughts move differently. Awareness shifts. The boundaries of self seem more permeable. The night dwellers lived in that state, built a civilization in it, clearly thrived in ways that suggest it wasn't a limitation but an advantage, at least for them. What did they know that we don't? The artifacts hint at the answer. Those spiral disks, those geometric patterns, those astronomical alignments, they're all pointing toward something. Some understanding, some practice, some way of being human that we've set aside. And maybe that's fine. Maybe we chose our path consciously, trading the night dwellers' perceptual gifts for daylight's practical advantages. Certainly our diurnal civilization has accomplished remarkable things. We've built technologies, sciences, systems of knowledge that have transformed existence. But at night, when you're alone with your thoughts, do you ever feel like something's missing? Some capacity or awareness that should be there but isn't? Some part of yourself that knows how to operate in darkness but never gets the chance? I think we all feel it sometimes. That sense that we're capable of more than we manifest. That there are doors in consciousness we don't know how to open or have forgotten how to open or aren't allowed to open by the structures of modern life. The night dwellers found some of those doors, walked through them, built a culture on the other side, and then they left, or transformed, or ascended, or simply scattered into history's shadows, leaving only these cryptic traces for us to puzzle over. The final mystery, the one that ties everything together. Why does their story call to us? Why do you feel something when you hear about settlements built in shadow, about people who chose darkness, about a culture that mapped consciousness instead of continents? Maybe because some part of us remembers. Not literally, not genetically, but in that deeper place where human experiences accumulate across generations. Jung called it the collective unconscious. Others call it cultural memory or ancestral wisdom. Whatever you name it, it's the sense that we've been here before. That what seems new is actually very old. That the night dwellers' questions are our questions too, just forgotten for a while. They asked, what can we become if we honor all of ourselves, including the parts that don't fit daylight's demands? We're still asking, still seeking, still drawn to darkness when we're honest enough to admit it. Let me tell you about the most recent discovery, the one that changed how we have to think about all of this. In 2019, a team working in southeastern Turkey uncovered a site that doesn't match the pattern of the other nocturnal settlements. It's older, dated to approximately 11,000 years ago, and its architectural structure is radically different. Not buildings pressed into a valley, but a complex of underground chambers carved directly into bedrock. Göbekli Tepe receives all the attention as the revolutionary site in that region, and rightly so. But this new site, which researchers have named Geyse Sarayı, the Night Palace, might be even more significant for understanding the night dwellers. The chambers extend deep underground. The primary level is nearly 50 meters below the surface. Multiple subterranean levels connected by carved passages. No natural light could ever reach the deepest chambers. Anyone living or working there would exist in complete darkness except for whatever fire they brought with them. And people did live there for extended periods. The evidence is unambiguous. Soot on the ceilings from countless lamps. Worn grooves in the floors where feet walked the same paths for years, for generations. Living spaces, working spaces, ceremonial spaces, all underground, all dark. Why would anyone choose this? Even for naturally nocturnal people, even for those who preferred shadow to sun, why retreat so completely underground? The answer might lie in what they carved on the walls. The chamber walls are covered with the most complex geometric patterns yet discovered from this era. Not just decorative motifs, but mathematical representations. Star charts of breathtaking accuracy. And something else, diagrams that researchers are still trying to interpret. They appear to be maps. But not maps of geography. Maps of something else. Connections, pathways, nodes arranged in patterns that look oddly familiar to modern scientists. They look like neural networks, like maps of consciousness itself. One chamber, the deepest, contains a single carved image. A spiral within a spiral within a spiral, descending into darkness at the center. It's hypnotic even in photographs. In person, lit only by lamplight, researchers report it's overwhelming. Several have refused to spend extended time in that chamber, reporting it makes them feel unstable, unmoored, like falling into something. Is this what the night dwellers were seeking? This sense of falling into consciousness, of exploring interior space as vast and complex as the exterior world. Geyse Sarayı predates the valley settlements by 2,000 years, which means it can't be explained as a development of nocturnal culture. It has to be the foundation, the source. The night dwellers didn't gradually develop their culture. They started with deliberate, complete rejection of daylight, with systematic exploration of what consciousness could do in absolute darkness. And then, 2,000 years later, some of them emerged, founded the valley settlements, lived in shadow rather than complete darkness, as if that underground experience had taught them what they needed to know, and they were ready to apply it in a slightly less extreme form. What happened in those 2,000 years? What did they discover in the deep darkness that made them ready to build settlements under stars? The artifacts from Geyse Sarayı include those stone discs, but more refined, more potent. Several are made from rare minerals that demonstrate sophisticated material knowledge. One disc contains a mineral that naturally phosphoresces. It glows faintly in total darkness, charging from any light exposure and releasing it gradually. Imagine the effect. You carry this disc into complete darkness, and it glows very faintly for hours. Just enough light to create shadows, to make darkness visible rather than absolute. Enough to see by but not enough to disrupt whatever neurological processes darkness triggers. They engineered their light sources not just to see, but to maintain specific consciousness states. That's not survival. That's a science we've forgotten existed. If you've stayed with me this far through all these questions and shadows, then you understand what we're really talking about. This isn't just archaeology. This is about human potential, about capacities we've set aside, about what we might become if we remembered. If that matters to you, leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me if you've experienced something in darkness that you can't quite explain. We're building a community of people willing to ask these questions. The excavation at Geyse Sarayı is ongoing. New chambers are being discovered. Each reveals more complexity, more sophistication, more evidence that whoever created this understood consciousness in ways we're only beginning to grasp with our neuroscience and psychology. But here's what troubles researchers. The site was deliberately sealed. Not abandoned, sealed. Someone carefully filled in the entrance passages with rubble, making it nearly impossible to find or access. This wasn't accidental. This was intentional hiding. Were they protecting something? Preventing access to knowledge they decided was dangerous? Or preserving it for a future time when humanity would be ready to understand? All we know is that 12,000 years ago, a group of humans decided to retreat underground and explore what consciousness could do in absolute darkness. They spent 2,000 years down there, developing practices and knowledge that generated the sophisticated nocturnal culture we see in the valley settlements. And then, 5,000 years after emerging from underground, that culture vanished. That's a 7,000-year arc, 7,000 years of continuous nocturnal culture, from deep underground to starlit valleys to dispersion into myth and legend. 7,000 years is longer than all of recorded history. It's longer than agriculture has existed in most of the world. It's nearly as long as the entire Holocene epoch, the geological period of climate stability that allowed civilization to develop. For context, the Egyptian pyramids are 4,500 years old. The Sumerian city-states arose 5,500 years ago. Writing was invented 5,000 years ago. The Night Dwellers' culture predates all of it and lasted longer than any of it. This wasn't a footnote in human history. This was a major chapter we've almost entirely lost. Why? How does a 7,000-year-old culture vanish so completely that we're only rediscovering it now? How does that much time, that many people, that much sophistication disappear from the record? The only answer is that it didn't disappear. Transformed. Went underground again, perhaps. Or dispersed so thoroughly into the broader human population that it became invisible, its knowledge fragmenting into mystery traditions and esoteric practices that survive without context. Look at Western esotericism. Mystery schools, secret societies, mystical traditions, all claiming ancient origins, all focused on altered consciousness, all using darkness and sensory manipulation as tools, usually dismissed as fantasy or fraud. But what if they're echoes? Degraded remnants of actual practices that actually worked, passed down through so many generations that the original context was lost but the techniques survived? The Night Dwellers might not be gone. They might be hidden in plain sight, their knowledge embedded in traditions we don't recognize because we've lost the key to interpreting them. That's not provable. That's speculation. But it's troubling speculation because it means we might be surrounded by fragments of lost wisdom without knowing how to reassemble them. The mathematics in those geometric patterns, we understand them now. Golden ratio, Fibonacci sequence, fractal scaling. We recognize these as fundamental to nature, to the structure of reality itself. The Night Dwellers embedded them in their art, their architecture, their consciousness tools. Not because they calculated them mathematically, there's no evidence of written calculation, but because they perceived them directly. They saw these patterns in their altered states and recognized them as true, as fundamental, which means they had direct perceptual access to mathematical truth. They could see the structure of reality without the intermediary of calculation and proof. That's what consciousness can do, apparently, under the right conditions. That's what living in darkness, exploring interior space, developing practices for shifting awareness, that's what it gives access to. We've chosen a different path. We've developed external tools, mathematics, science, technology, to understand reality's structure. And that works. It's given us tremendous power and knowledge. But we've lost the internal tools, the direct perceptual access, the ability to know truth by experiencing it rather than proving it. Neither path is wrong. But we've forgotten that the other path exists. We've forgotten that consciousness itself can be a tool for understanding reality, not just a vessel for holding information gathered by other means. The Night Dwellers knew this, lived this, built a 7,000-year civilization on it, and then left us these traces, these shadows, these whispers carved in stone, as if to say, this is possible. This is what humans can do. Don't forget. There's an artifact I haven't mentioned yet because it doesn't fit any easy interpretation. because it raises more questions than any reasonable analysis can handle. In one of the valley settlements, carefully placed in a sealed chamber beneath what appears to have been a communal gathering space, archaeologists found a large polished obsidian mirror, nearly perfect in its curvature, polished to a degree that requires sophisticated abrasive techniques. It's a masterwork of Neolithic craftsmanship. But that's not the unusual part. The mirror is positioned at a precise angle to reflect the night sky through a carefully engineered opening in the chamber's ceiling. On specific nights, when certain stars pass overhead, their light reflects off the mirror onto the chamber's back wall. The wall has been prepared with a white limestone coating. When starlight hits it after reflecting from the obsidian, the light diffuses, creating a glow that illuminates the entire chamber with the faintest, most delicate light imaginable. It's beautiful. It's technically sophisticated. It's completely impractical for any utilitarian purpose. It's art, or ritual, or both. A mechanism for bringing starlight underground, for creating a space illuminated by nothing but the reflected light of distant suns. Why would anyone build this? What purpose does it serve? The researchers who discovered it spent one night in the chamber during the correct stellar alignment. They reported the experience was profound. The quality of light, so faint, so gentle, barely distinguishable from darkness yet definitely present, created a sense of being suspended between states. Not in light, not in darkness, but in some liminal space between them. Several reported feeling like they were floating. Time became difficult to track. Thoughts moved in unusual patterns, more associative, more symbolic. Nothing dramatic, nothing like hallucination, just a subtle shift in how consciousness operated. This is what the night dwellers created space for. These subtle shifts, these liminal states, these experiences that can't be measured or quantified but that clearly meant something profound to them. We've lost the language for this. We don't have words for experiences that aren't either fully ordinary consciousness or dramatically altered states. We can't talk about subtle shifts, gentle transformations, the quiet opening of perceptual doors. But the night dwellers could. They built architecture for it, developed tools for it, made it central to their culture. The mirror chamber is just one example. Almost every excavated site contains similar spaces, places engineered for specific light conditions, specific acoustic properties, specific qualities of experience. They were curating consciousness, deliberately creating environments that would shift awareness in particular ways. That's not primitive. That's incredibly sophisticated. That's understanding that external environment shapes internal experience, and using that knowledge to guide people toward specific states of being. Modern architecture is beginning to rediscover this. Studies on how building design affects mood, cognition, well-being. The night dwellers were applying these principles 9,000 years ago, except they were doing it for darkness, not light. For states of consciousness we don't even have names for anymore. Every culture that develops meditation, contemplative practice, mystical tradition eventually stumbles onto similar insights. External conditions matter. Light, sound, scent, spatial geometry, they all affect consciousness. Control them and you can guide experience. But most cultures develop this knowledge slowly, empirically, over centuries of trial and error. The night dwellers seem to have started with it. As if it was foundational knowledge, as if they began with the premise that consciousness was something to be explored and shaped, and everything else followed from that. What would a civilization look like if that was its starting assumption? If instead of asking, how do we get food, water, shelter, it asked, how do we understand consciousness, navigate its possibilities, expand its capabilities? You'd get the night dwellers. You'd get people who retreat underground for 2,000 years, who build valley settlements oriented to stars, who create tools for inducing trance and mechanisms for reflecting starlight into prepared chambers. You'd get a civilization that looks completely alien to ours because it's optimized for different goals, different values, different priorities. We optimize for productivity, for material accumulation, for technological advancement. Those are valid goals. They've served us well. But they're not the only possible goals. The night dwellers optimized for something else. Consciousness exploration. perceptual expansion, understanding interior space. And they achieved remarkable things in pursuit of those goals. Things we're only beginning to recognize as achievements because we're only beginning to remember that those goals exist. Modern psychology is rediscovering what the night dwellers knew. Consciousness isn't fixed. It's flexible, can be trained, shaped, expanded. Meditation changes brain structure. Psychedelics reveal perceptual capacities normally hidden. Sensory deprivation induces profound experiences. We're learning this through careful scientific study, through controlled experiments, through peer-reviewed research, which is valuable, but it's also slow. The night dwellers took a different approach. They just did it. They created the conditions, entered the states, developed the practices, and built a culture on the results. 7,000 years of continuous exploration of consciousness. 7,000 years of accumulated knowledge about what awareness can do, what perception can access, what understanding is possible. And it's gone, or hidden, or fragmented beyond recognition. That's the tragedy. Not that they vanished, but that their knowledge vanished with them. That we're having to rediscover it from scratch, slowly, incompletely, without the benefit of their accumulated wisdom. Unless it's not entirely gone. Unless fragments remain, encoded in myths and symbols and practices we don't fully understand. Every mystery tradition claims ancient origins. Usually we dismiss that as mystique building, as invented pedigree. But what if some are telling the truth? What if they really do preserve knowledge from the night dwellers, passed down through so many generations that the context is lost but the core practices remain? That's unprovable. But it's worth considering. Worth looking at those traditions with fresh eyes, asking not, is this legitimate? But, what if this is a fragment of something much older and more sophisticated than we realized? The Hermetic tradition's obsession with darkness and light as symbolic opposites. The Orphic mysteries' use of darkness in initiation. The cave retreats of ancient mystics. The meditation tradition's emphasis on darkness meditation. Maybe these aren't just symbolic. Maybe they're echoes of actual practices developed by the night dwellers, preserved because they work, because they reliably induce valuable states, even if the people practicing them have forgotten why. If I'm right, then the night dwellers are still teaching us, still reaching across millennia through the practices they developed, even though we don't recognize our teachers anymore. That's both beautiful and sad. Beautiful that knowledge can survive that long, through that many transformations. Sad that we've lost the context that would let us fully understand and apply it. But maybe that's changing. Maybe we're finally ready to remember. Look at the explosion of interest in consciousness studies, in meditation, in psychedelics, in altered states. We're collectively waking up to what the night dwellers knew. That consciousness is the frontier, that interior space is as vast as exterior space, that understanding awareness is as important as understanding matter. We're asking their questions again, using different methods, different frameworks, different language. But the same fundamental curiosity drives us. What can consciousness do? What can we become? Maybe this is the moment the night dwellers were waiting for. Maybe they sealed Gay Saray and departed the valley settlements knowing that humanity would eventually circle back, would eventually remember that these questions matter. Maybe we're not rediscovering their knowledge. Maybe we're finally catching up to where they were 12,000 years ago, finally ready to understand what they were trying to tell us. That's a humbling thought, that we're not the pinnacle of human development but the return to an older, wiser way after millennia of distraction. But it's also hopeful, because if they could do it, we can do it. If they could maintain 7,000 years of consciousness-focused culture, maybe we can too. Maybe we can build on what they discovered instead of starting over. Maybe that's what the artifacts are for. Not museum pieces, not archaeological curiosities, but seeds, instructions, maps of where they went and how they got there, preserved in stone and geometry and astronomical alignments, waiting for us to learn their language and follow. Let's talk about what this means for us. For you, sitting here in the dark or the light, listening to this story about people who chose shadow. Because this isn't just history. This is a mirror. The night dwellers are asking you a question. Across all those millennia, what have you chosen to explore? What capacities within yourself remain unmapped? We live in a world that has banished darkness almost completely. You can go weeks, months, years without experiencing true darkness. There's always a light somewhere. Streetlights, screens, LEDs glowing from every device. We've created an environment of perpetual illumination. And we wonder why we can't sleep. Why anxiety and restlessness plague us. Why our circadian rhythms are shattered. Why we feel perpetually exhausted yet unable to rest. Maybe we're not meant to live in constant light. Maybe darkness isn't something to defeat but something to embrace. Not as absence but as presence. Not as emptiness but as a different kind of fullness. The night dwellers understood this. They built their entire civilization on it. I'm not suggesting you move underground or abandon daylight. But maybe, occasionally, you could sit in complete darkness. No screens, no lights, just darkness. And notice what happens. Notice how thought changes, how awareness shifts, how the boundaries of self become more permeable, more flexible, how you become more conscious of interior space, of the vast territories inside that daylight keeps hidden. This isn't mysticism. This is neurology. Darkness triggers specific processes in your brain, melatonin cascades, DMT production, shifts in brainwave patterns. Your consciousness literally operates differently in darkness than in light. Modern life keeps you in perpetual light consciousness, which is useful for productivity, for staying alert, for engaging with external tasks. But it's only half of what you're capable of. Half of what you are. The night dwellers lived in the other half. Explored it, mapped it, built tools and practices and entire cultural systems around it. And then tried to teach us, tried to leave us guides, tried to preserve the knowledge that this other half exists and matters. We forgot, chose daylight exclusively, built everything around external accomplishment and ignored interior exploration. But you can remember, right now, tonight, by simply choosing darkness, by sitting with it, by allowing it to show you what light obscures. I've done this, many nights, just sitting in complete darkness. No agenda, no meditation technique, just being present with darkness and seeing what emerges. It's remarkable, not dramatic, not mystical light shows or cosmic downloads, just subtle shifts in perception, gentle openings of awareness, quiet recognition of capacities that daylight keeps dormant. You think differently in darkness, more symbolically, more associatively, more holistically. Linear logic relaxes. Pattern recognition heightens. You notice connections you'd miss in daylight's focus. And you feel differently, more connected to something vast and ancient, more aware of yourself as part of long lineages, deep time, the immense flow of consciousness exploring itself through countless forms across vast epochs. The night dwellers felt this all the time. It was their baseline. And from that baseline, they developed knowledge and practices we're only beginning to glimpse. You have the same neurology they did, the same potential, the same capacity to operate in darkness consciousness and discover what's there. All you have to do is turn off the lights. If you try this, if you spend time in darkness and discover something, tell me about it. Leave a comment. Share your experience. Let's build a community of people willing to explore the territories the night dwellers mapped, willing to remember what we've forgotten. The intellectual understanding is one thing. Reading about the night dwellers, considering the implications, appreciating the sophistication, that's valuable. But it's incomplete. The real teaching is experiential. It's what happens when you actually sit in darkness. When you allow your consciousness to shift into the states the night dwellers inhabited. When you feel directly what they were working with. That's not something I can give you through words. That's something you have to discover yourself. But I can tell you it's worth discovering. I can tell you that there are aspects of your own consciousness you haven't met yet, capacities you haven't used, awareness you haven't accessed. The night dwellers knew this, structured their entire civilization around exploring it. Spent 7,000 years mapping interior space while our ancestors were mapping continents and building cities and inventing agriculture. Neither path is wrong. But we've forgotten that both exist. We've collapsed human achievement into one narrow definition. External mastery, technological advancement, material accumulation. The night dwellers offer an alternative. Interior mastery, consciousness advancement, experiential accumulation. You don't have to choose one path exclusively, but you should know both exist. Should know that your ancestors, not necessarily genetic ancestors but human ancestors, people who shared your basic neurology and potential, achieved remarkable things by exploring interior space with the same dedication we apply to exterior space. And they left you instructions. Not in language you can read directly, but in artifacts and architecture and astronomical alignments. In practices that survive in mystery traditions and meditation techniques. In your own neurology, which still responds to darkness the way theirs did. You are carrying their legacy whether you know it or not. You are capable of what they were capable of. The same doors they opened are available to you. All that's required is darkness, and curiosity, and willingness to discover what your consciousness can do when you stop flooding it with constant light and external stimulation. This is the night dweller's gift. Not their artifacts, fascinating as those are. Not their settlements, mysterious as those remain. But the simple, profound recognition that darkness is a teacher. That consciousness is explorable. That you are more than daylight reveals. That's what survives. That's what matters. That's what they were trying to tell us across all those millennia. Listen, the answer isn't in more light. It's not in more information, more stimulation, more external accomplishment. It's in remembering how to sit in darkness, how to let consciousness shift into its other modes, how to explore interior space with the same courage and curiosity the night dwellers brought to it. They were human like you. They didn't have special powers or different biology. They just chose differently, chose to explore what happens in darkness instead of constantly fleeing it, chose to map consciousness instead of continents. Chose interior discovery over external conquest. And they found something. Built a 7,000-year civilization on what they found. Developed practices and knowledge that were so valuable, so profound, they tried to preserve them for future generations who might remember to look. That's you. You're the future generation. You're who they were preserving this for. So what will you do with it? Will you dismiss it as interesting history and continue living in perpetual light? Or will you accept the invitation, turn off the lights, and discover what darkness has to teach? The night dwellers can't answer that for you. They can only offer the possibility, preserved in stone and starlight and the quiet whisper of ancient knowledge waiting to be remembered. The choice is yours. It always has been. There's one final piece of evidence I've been saving. One artifact that crystallizes everything we've explored and points toward something even deeper. In 2021, during the final season of excavation at one of the Northern Valley sites before it was sealed for preservation, a team discovered a chamber that had been completely overlooked in previous surveys. It was small, easily missed, sealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall but was actually a precisely fitted stone door. Inside, untouched for 9,000 years, they found a single object, a sphere of polished black basalt, roughly the size of a human head, carved with the most intricate surface pattern yet discovered from this period. The sphere is covered in tiny geometric designs, so small and precise they require magnification to fully appreciate. At first glance, it appears to be purely decorative, but analysis revealed something extraordinary. The patterns aren't random. They're mathematical. Specifically, they're a three-dimensional representation of what modern mathematicians call a strange attractor. A pattern that emerges from chaotic systems, revealing the hidden order underlying apparent randomness. These are the same patterns neuroscientists observe in brain activity during certain altered states. The same patterns that appear in psychedelic experiences, in deep meditation, in the moments when ordinary consciousness shifts into something else. The night dwellers carved it in stone 9,000 years ago. Let that sink in. 9,000 years ago, someone understood chaotic dynamics, understood the mathematical structure of altered consciousness, well enough to encode it in a physical object. Not approximately, not symbolically, precisely, with geometric accuracy that matches modern mathematical models. How? There are only two possibilities. Either they developed mathematical understanding equivalent to modern chaos theory through pure reasoning and observation, which would require sophisticated written mathematical notation and centuries of accumulated research, neither of which we have evidence for. Or they perceived these patterns directly, saw them during altered states, recognized them as fundamental and carved what they experienced. The second explanation is more disturbing, because it implies that consciousness, under the right conditions, can directly perceive mathematical truth. That awareness can access information about reality's structure without the intermediary of calculation and proof. That's what the night dwellers were exploring. That's what 7,000 years of darkness-based culture was for. They were developing human consciousness into an instrument for perceiving truth directly, for seeing the patterns underlying reality without needing to prove them mathematically. And apparently they succeeded. The sphere is so precisely carved that researchers initially thought it must be a fake, a modern creation placed as a hoax. But every test, radiocarbon dating of organic residue in the carving grooves, thermoluminescence dating of the stone surface, analysis of tool marks, confirms it. It's authentic. It's Neolithic. It's impossible. Except it exists, which means it's not impossible. It means our understanding of what Neolithic people could know, could perceive, could create is fundamentally wrong. The sphere is now the most closely studied artifact from any of the nocturnal sites. Physicists, mathematicians, neuroscientists, archaeologists, all trying to understand what it represents, how it was made, what it means. But maybe the point isn't to study it from outside. Maybe the point is to use it, to do what the night dwellers did. Sit with it in darkness, let your consciousness shift, and see if it teaches you something directly. Several researchers have tried this, though it's not officially sanctioned. They report similar experiences. The sphere seems to become more than a physical object. In darkness, lit only by flickering lamp light, the patterns seem to move, to shift, to draw awareness inward and downward into something vast and strange. One researcher described it as falling into mathematics. Another said it felt like consciousness recognizing its own structure. A third simply said, it knows what it is, and it shows you. That's not scientific language. That's the language of direct experience, of encounters with something that transcends ordinary understanding. It's the only language we have for what the sphere does to consciousness. This is what the night dwellers left us. Not just artifacts to study but tools to use. Not just history to analyze but practices to engage. Not just knowledge about the past but a pathway to experiences we've forgotten are possible. The sphere was sealed away deliberately, hidden in a secret chamber, preserved carefully, protected from casual discovery. Why? What makes it so important that it required special protection? Maybe because it's a key, a tool that, used correctly, opens consciousness to direct perception of mathematical truth. A shortcut to understanding that bypasses the slow accumulation of rational proof. That's dangerous knowledge. In the wrong context, at the wrong time, it could be misunderstood, misused, dismissed as impossible. Better to hide it. Wait for a time when humanity is ready to understand. Maybe that time is now. Maybe that's why we're finding these sites now, why we're developing the scientific tools to analyze them properly, why we're asking the right questions finally. The night dwellers couldn't teach us directly. The gap is too vast, the cultural context too different. But they could leave us tools, encoded in stone and geometry and astronomical alignments, waiting for us to develop the understanding to recognize them. And once we recognize them, once we see what they actually are, we can use them. We can repeat their experiments. We can enter the darkness, shift our consciousness, and discover what they discovered. That's not mysticism. That's the scientific method applied to consciousness. That's empirical investigation of subjective experience. That's taking the night dwellers' results and testing them, verifying them, building on them. This is where archaeology becomes something more, where history becomes instruction, where the past offers not just information about what was but guidance toward what could be. If you understand what I'm saying, if you feel the weight of this possibility, if some part of you recognizes that this is true, that consciousness really can do this, that the night dwellers really did discover something profound and really did try to preserve it for us, then you're ready. ready to stop just learning about them and start learning from them, ready to engage with their tools, their practices, their 7,000-year exploration of what awareness can access. I can't tell you exactly how. The specifics died with their culture, or transformed into mystery traditions we don't fully understand. But the basic principle remains: darkness, patience, openness, and objects like that sphere that can guide consciousness toward specific perceptions. You can experiment. You can try. You can sit in darkness with geometric patterns and see what emerges. Not expecting dramatic results. Not demanding cosmic revelation. Just open to whatever subtle shifts occur. That's what the night dwellers did. That's how they spent 7,000 years. That's how they created their culture and developed their knowledge. You can do the same. Not for 7,000 years. Not as a full-time dedication. But occasionally. Regularly. Enough to discover whether this really works, whether consciousness really can perceive truth directly when properly prepared. I think it can. I think the night dwellers proved it can. I think that sphere, with its impossible mathematical precision, is evidence that humans can do remarkable things when we explore interior space with the same rigor we apply to exterior space. And I think you can verify this yourself. Not by believing me, not by accepting their authority, but by trying. By experimenting. By treating consciousness as the mystery it is and approaching it with genuine curiosity. That's the night dweller's final gift. Not answers but methods. Not beliefs but practices. Not dogma but invitation to discover for yourself. Will you accept it? So here we are. At the end of this journey through shadow and stone. Through 9,000 years and 17 settlements. Through underground chambers and valley dwellings. Through geometric patterns and astronomical alignments. What have we learned? What do we actually know? We know that humans once built a civilization optimized for darkness instead of light. That they did this deliberately, systematically, successfully for at least 1,500 years, possibly much longer. That they developed tools, practices, and knowledge we're only beginning to understand. We know they weren't primitive, weren't limited by lack of technology or understanding. They made conscious choices about how to live, what to value, what to explore. And they chose differently than we do. We know they were fascinated by consciousness, by altered states, by what perception could access under specific conditions. That they built architecture to facilitate this, created objects to guide it, oriented their entire culture around exploring it. We know they achieved remarkable things. Astronomical knowledge requiring centuries of careful observation, mathematical understanding that encoded complex patterns in stone, practices that reliably induced valuable states of awareness. We know they tried to preserve this knowledge. Sealed chambers, cached artifacts, carved instructions in geometric language, as if they knew their culture wouldn't last but hoped their discoveries might. And we know they vanished or transformed or dispersed, leaving only traces, whispers, fragments for us to find and puzzle over. That's the knowable history, the archaeology, the facts we can verify with carbon dating and spectral analysis and careful excavation. But there's another story underneath that one. A story about what the night dwellers actually experienced. What they found in darkness. What consciousness revealed when they explored it with dedication and sophistication. That story isn't in the artifacts. It's in the direct experience of following where they pointed. Of sitting in darkness. Of allowing awareness to shift. Of discovering for yourself what they discovered. I can't give you that story. You have to write it yourself. But I can tell you it's worth writing. I can tell you that the territories they mapped are still accessible, the practices they developed still work, the capacities they demonstrated are still latent in your neurology waiting to be activated. The night dwellers aren't dead. They're dormant, sleeping in your own consciousness, waiting for you to remember what they knew, waiting for darkness to teach you what light obscures. This isn't metaphor. This is as literal as I can be about something inherently experiential. Your brain, right now, contains the same structures theirs did. Your consciousness, right now, can access the same states they accessed. Your perception, right now, could reveal the same truths they perceived. All that's missing is the context, the practice, the willingness to sit in darkness and discover what's there. The night dwellers spent 7,000 years on this exploration. You don't need 7,000 years. You don't even need 7 years. But you need something. Some regular engagement. Some genuine curiosity. Some willingness to trade a few hours of screen time for darkness time, external stimulation for interior exploration. What would you discover? I don't know. Each person brings different sensitivities, different questions, different contexts. The night dwellers built a shared culture because they were exploring together, comparing experiences, developing shared language and practices. You're exploring alone, or with a scattered community of fellow seekers who mostly can't meet face to face. That's harder, but it's also more necessary, because you're not trying to recreate their culture. You're trying to integrate their discoveries into your life, your time, your circumstances. You're trying to remember what they knew while still living in the daylight world. That's a different challenge than they faced. But it's your challenge, your opportunity, your potential contribution to the long arc of consciousness exploring itself. If you've made it this far, all the way through this exploration, then something in you resonates with this story. Something recognizes it as true, as important, as relevant to your own life and development. Trust that. Follow it. Let it guide you into darkness, into exploration, into discovery. Subscribe if you want more of these stories, more questions, more invitations to remember what we've forgotten. But more importantly, try it. Sit in darkness. Notice what happens. Let the night dwellers teach you directly, across the millennia, through the shared experience of human consciousness encountering itself. That's what this was all about. Not the facts of their settlements or the precision of their artifacts, but the possibility they represent. The reminder that humans can be more than we typically are. That consciousness is explorable territory. That interior space is as vast as exterior space. That darkness is not empty but full. Full of subtle perceptions, gentle shifts, quiet revelations that don't announce themselves with fanfare, but that accumulate over time into genuine transformation. The night dwellers knew this, lived it, built a remarkable culture on it. And then, for reasons we may never fully understand, they departed. But not without leaving signposts, breadcrumbs, invitations carved in stone for whoever might follow. That's you. You're the follower, the seeker, the one who stumbled across their traces and felt that pull of recognition, that sense that this matters somehow. It does matter, because you matter, because your consciousness matters, because what you discover in darkness adds to the collective human understanding of what awareness can do, what perception can access, what we can become. The night dwellers started something 7,000 years ago, something that seemed to end when their settlements emptied. But maybe it didn't end. Maybe it just went dormant, waiting for individuals scattered across time and space to find those traces and remember. Waiting for you. This is where I leave you. In darkness or in light, wherever you're listening from. With questions instead of answers. With invitations instead of instructions. With the simple recognition that you are capable of more than you typically manifest, that consciousness is deeper than you typically explore, that the night dwellers' discoveries are your inheritance if you choose to claim them. Choose wisely. Choose bravely. Choose to remember what darkness knows and light forgets. The night dwellers are waiting. In the shadows between your thoughts. In the quiet hours after midnight. In the vast, unexplored territories of your own awareness. They've been waiting for 9,000 years. They can wait a little longer. But can you? Before we part, there's one more thing I need to tell you. One more layer to this mystery that connects everything we've explored to something happening right now, in this moment, as you listen. In 2023, researchers began a new kind of analysis of artifacts from the nocturnal sites. Using artificial intelligence trained on pattern recognition, they fed images of the carved geometric designs into neural networks to see if they could detect patterns invisible to human analysis. The results were startling. The AI identified recurring mathematical structures across all 17 sites, structures so consistent and precise that they couldn't be coincidental. More remarkably, these structures matched specific brain wave patterns associated with particular states of consciousness. The night dwellers weren't just decorating their artifacts. They were encoding information about consciousness states directly into physical objects, creating a library of awareness, written in a language that doesn't use words but geometry, that doesn't describe experiences but embeds them. Those carved spirals that create optical illusions in flickering light, they're not random. They're precisely calculated to induce specific brainwave entrainment, to guide the viewer's consciousness toward particular states through pure visual rhythm. That sphere with the strange attractor pattern? It's not just representing chaos mathematics. It's a tool for inducing the exact brain state in which those patterns become directly perceptible. It's self-referential, an object that teaches you to see what it is. This is technology. Not mechanical technology, not digital technology, but consciousness technology. Tools designed to interface with awareness, to shift it, to guide it toward specific experiences and perceptions. The night dwellers were consciousness engineers. That's the only adequate term. They were building tools for awareness the way we build tools for manipulating matter. And they achieved sophistication we're only beginning to match with our neural interface research and consciousness studies. What's more, the patterns work. Modern subjects exposed to these geometric designs under controlled conditions show measurable shifts in brain activity. The patterns do what they were designed to do 9,000 years later, even though we don't fully understand how. We've inherited a technology we don't know how to use. We have the hardware, our neural systems that still respond to these patterns, and we have the software, the artifacts themselves, but we've lost the user manual, the cultural context that explained what these tools were for and how to apply them effectively. But we're remembering, slowly, through careful research and brave experimentation, through people willing to sit in darkness with these patterns and report what happens, through the gradual reconstruction of a knowledge base that once supported an entire civilization. This is happening now, not in the distant past. Right now, the night dwellers' legacy is being actively recovered, tested, integrated into modern understanding. Their consciousness technology is being rediscovered and, eventually, deployed. What will we do with it? That's the question this generation faces. Will we treat it as archaeological curiosity, interesting but irrelevant to modern life? Will we lock it away in museums where it can be observed but not used? Will we dismiss it as primitive superstition despite evidence that it works? Or will we recognize it for what it is? A sophisticated technology for consciousness exploration developed by people who dedicated centuries to this pursuit and left us their results to build upon. The choice isn't mine alone. It's collective. It's what we decide as a culture about whether interior exploration matters, whether consciousness development is valuable, whether the night dwellers' 7,000-year project deserves continuation. I think it does. I think we need what they discovered. Not to abandon daylight and retreat underground, but to integrate both modes, daylight's focus and darkness's expansion, external achievement and interior development, material mastery and consciousness sophistication. We've spent the last several thousand years developing external technology. We've gotten remarkably good at manipulating matter, energy, information. We've built impressive civilizations on that expertise. But we've neglected interior technology. We've treated consciousness as fixed, as given, as something that happens to us rather than something we can cultivate and refine. We've forgotten that awareness itself can be a tool, that perception can be trained, that states of consciousness can be deliberately induced and utilized. The night dwellers remembered, or never forgot, and now they're offering to teach us again, through artifacts that still function as intended millennia after their creators vanished. That's extraordinary. That's a gift across time of almost incomprehensible generosity. To develop sophisticated technology, to refine it over centuries, to carefully preserve it, all in hope that some future civilization might find it and understand its value. They couldn't know we'd eventually appear, couldn't guarantee we'd develop the scientific methods to analyze their work properly, couldn't ensure we'd be interested in consciousness exploration at all. But they tried anyway, left us everything they could. As if to say, we learned something important, something that might help you. Please don't let it be lost forever. We're at the inflection point, the moment when we either accept their gift or let it fade back into obscurity. The moment when we either integrate their discoveries into our civilization or dismiss them as interesting but ultimately irrelevant. What happens next depends on individuals, on people who hear this story and feel that resonance, that pull, that sense of recognition, on people willing to try sitting in darkness, to experiment with these patterns, to explore consciousness with the same courage the night dwellers brought to it. On people like you, because you're here, you've listened this far. Something drew you to this story, kept you engaged through all these questions and shadows and impossible artifacts. That something is important. That's your own consciousness recognizing an invitation meant for you specifically. The night dwellers are calling across the millennia. They're calling to people who are ready to remember, ready to explore, ready to continue what they started. Are you one of them? Does this story live in you now, asking to be more than information, asking to become practice? I hope so, because we need more explorers, more people willing to map interior space, to develop consciousness technologies, to remember that awareness is as explorable as outer space and potentially as full of discovery. The night dwellers can't complete this work. They did their part. 7,000 years of exploration, incredible discoveries, carefully preserved artifacts. Now it's our turn, our opportunity, our responsibility, to remember, to practice, to discover for ourselves what they discovered, and then to pass it forward to future generations who will continue this work, who will build on what we learn just as we're building on what the night dwellers left us. This is the great project. Consciousness exploring itself across vast stretches of time, each generation adding their discoveries, each culture contributing their unique perspective, until eventually we understand what awareness truly is and what it's capable of becoming. The night dwellers were one chapter in that project. A long, sophisticated, remarkable chapter. But just one chapter. We're writing the next one. Right now. Through choices we make about what to explore, what to value, what to spend our limited time and attention pursuing. Choose well. Choose wisely. Choose to remember that you are more than daylight reveals, that darkness has gifts to offer, that the night dweller's invitation is real and waiting for your response. They've done their part. The artifacts exist. The patterns work. The knowledge is accessible. All that's missing is you. Your choice. Your commitment. Your willingness to sit in darkness and discover what's there. What will you choose? I want to end where we began, with a question. Not the same question, but its reflection, its echo across everything we've explored together. The question the night dwellers asked themselves 9,000 years ago when they first descended into those underground chambers, when they first oriented their doors away from sunrise, when they first chose shadow over sun. What are we willing to sacrifice to discover who we truly are? Because that's what they did. They sacrificed daylight, sacrificed the practical advantages of solar orientation, the vitamin D benefits, the social prestige of participating in the emerging daylight cultures that were beginning to dominate the Neolithic world. They sacrificed conventional success, conventional comfort, conventional understanding. They made themselves strange, other, separate from the mainstream of human development. And in return, they gained something. Something profound enough to sustain a culture for 7,000 years. Something valuable enough to preserve carefully for civilizations they'd never meet. Something true enough that it still works, still matters, still calls to us across the millennia. What was it? What did they find in darkness that was worth all that sacrifice? The artifacts hint at answers. Direct perception of mathematical truth, expanded consciousness states, sophisticated understanding of awareness itself. But these are descriptions, not experiences. They're maps, not territories. They're words pointing at something words can't contain. The only way to really know what they found is to follow them into darkness and discover it yourself. To make your own sacrifice. Not of your entire life, not of daylight completely, but of some time, some attention, some willingness to explore what you've been taught to ignore. A few hours a week in complete darkness. No screens, no distractions. Just you and shadow and whatever emerges when you stop running from it. That's all it takes to begin. To step onto the path the night dwellers mapped so carefully. Is it worth it? I can't answer that for you. But I can tell you what I've found, what others have found, what the artifacts suggest the night dwellers found. that consciousness is far more flexible, far more capable, far more interesting than ordinary experience reveals. That you are not fixed, not limited to the self you know in daylight, that there are other modes of being, other ways of perceiving, other capacities waiting to be discovered. That darkness is a teacher, patient, subtle, profound, teaching not through words but through direct experience, through the gradual revelation of what you are beyond your daylight identity. The night dwellers dedicated themselves to this teaching, became its students for generations, and apparently learned lessons so valuable they couldn't bear to see them lost. So they carved them in stone, encoded them in geometry, preserved them in sealed chambers and carefully cached artifacts, created a message that would survive millennia, waiting for people who were ready to hear it. That message is, you are more than you think you are. Consciousness is explorable territory. Darkness has gifts for those brave enough to receive them. Simple message, but profound implications. Because if it's true, if we really are more than we typically manifest, if consciousness really is explorable, if darkness really does have gifts, then everything changes. How we spend our time, what we value, what we consider important, what we teach our children, how we structure our societies, what we aspire to become. The night dwellers built an entire civilization on this recognition. We don't have to go that far, but we should go somewhere. We should let their discovery matter. We should honor their 7,000-year effort by at least trying what they tried. What's the risk? A few hours sitting in darkness. Maybe it reveals nothing. Maybe you find it boring or uncomfortable or pointless. Then you stop, having lost only time. But maybe you find something. Maybe darkness opens doors you didn't know existed. Maybe consciousness shows you capacities you've never accessed. Maybe you discover that the night dwellers were right, that there is treasure in shadow for those willing to seek it. That possibility seems worth exploring. Worth risking a few hours of your one wild and precious life to investigate. Worth honoring the night dweller's gift by actually using it rather than just studying it from comfortable distance. This is my final invitation. Not to believe me, not to accept any claims on faith, but to try, to experiment, to approach consciousness with scientific curiosity and see what you discover. Sit in complete darkness, regularly, patiently, with no expectations but genuine openness. Notice what happens. Track the changes. Document your experiences. Treat it as the research it is, consciousness studying itself, awareness exploring its own possibilities. If you do this, if you really commit to it, you'll be continuing the night dweller's work. You'll be adding your experiences to the long human project of understanding what awareness is and what it can become. You'll be validating or refuting their discoveries through your own direct investigation. That's science. That's how we learn. That's how knowledge accumulates across generations. Someone makes a discovery, preserves the methodology, and others replicate the experiment to see if they get the same results. The night dwellers preserved their methodology as best they could in stone and geometric patterns. Now we replicate their experiment. Darkness, patience, openness, careful observation of what emerges. If it works, if you discover what they discovered, then we know their findings were real, reproducible, valuable. If it doesn't work, that's also valuable information. Either way, we learn. Either way, we honor their effort by taking it seriously enough to test it. I've done this testing, spent countless hours in darkness, following where the night dwellers pointed. I found things, subtle shifts in perception, gentle expansions of awareness, quiet revelations that don't announce themselves dramatically, but that accumulate into genuine transformation. I can't prove these experiences to you. I can only report them and invite you to investigate for yourself. That's all the night dwellers could do too. Report their findings and hope future generations would care enough to verify them. We're those future generations. You and me and everyone drawn to this story. We're the ones the artifacts were preserved for, the ones the sealed chambers were waiting for, the ones who might finally understand what the night dwellers were trying to tell us. So understand. Not just intellectually but experientially. Not just by hearing their story, but by living your own version of it. By sitting in darkness and discovering what it reveals. by continuing their exploration with your own consciousness, your own questions, your own discoveries. This is how traditions survive. Not through institutions or dogmas or unchanged practices, but through individuals who catch the spark, who feel the pull, who choose to continue the work even though it's difficult, strange, countercultural. The Night Dwellers tradition is yours now. Yours to continue or let die. Yours to explore or ignore. Yours to pass forward or let fade into obscurity. What will you choose? Will you let this story end with you? Just interesting information that entertained you briefly? Or will you let it begin with you, the start of your own exploration, your own discoveries, your own chapter in the long story of consciousness investigating itself? The Night Dwellers are waiting. In the darkness you've been avoiding. In the consciousness you haven't fully explored. In the potential you haven't yet accessed. They've been waiting 9,000 years. They can wait a little longer. But maybe they don't have to. Maybe tonight you turn off the lights and begin.